All right, let's jump right in. We're going to talk about a really powerful story today, one that comes from the time of the prophet Musa. It's all about a community that thought they were clever enough to find a loophole in a divine law. But what happened next? Well, it became a warning for the ages. So that really brings us to the core question here. What does happen when people try to get tricky with a divine rule? We're going to dig into exactly what this community did, what was going through their heads, and the outcome, which, trust me, is pretty unforgettable. Okay, so let's set this scene. Picture this, a town of the Bani Israel, living right by the sea. Life is good, it's peaceful, they're blessed. But their faith, their obedience was about to be put to the test. And not just any test, a really specific and pretty strange one. The command from Allah was actually super simple. It was, do not fish on Saturday. That's it. Saturday was the Sabbath, a day for worship, for rest. So any other work, especially their main job, which was fishing, was completely off limits for that one day. Seems like a pretty straightforward test of obedience, right? Okay, but here's the catch. This is what made the test so tough. It wasn't just about having willpower. It was this crazy, visible temptation they had to face every single week. See, on weekdays, there were hardly any fish. They'd struggle to catch anything. But on Saturday, the one day they weren't allowed to fish, the sea would be absolutely packed with them. They were practically jumping out of the water right by the shore. I mean, imagine that. It made resisting this challenge incredibly difficult. So, with a temptation like that right in their faces every week, well, it wasn't long before some people started to let greed take over. They didn't want to just openly break the rule, but man, they really wanted those fish. So what do? They come up with a plan. A plan they think is super clever, a way to get around the command. And here's how their little trick worked. It was basically a three-step process. First, on Friday, the day before the Sabbath, they'd go out and do all the prep work. They'd dig these little channels and traps right near the sea. Then, step two, on Saturday, they'd do nothing. They'd just kick back and rest, and all those fish would swim right into the traps and get stuck. And then finally, on Sunday, once the Sabbath was over, all they had to do was stroll over and collect this huge, massive catch. Easy, right? And this right here is the most important part, how they justified it to themselves. In their minds, they weren't technically fishing on Saturday, were they? I mean, they weren't throwing nets, they weren't holding fishing rods, they were just collecting fish on a Sunday, fish that just happened to get trapped on Saturday. See the logic? They completely convinced themselves they'd found the perfect loophole. They were following the letter of the law, but totally, completely ignoring its spirit. But, not everyone in town was buying it. There was another group, a righteous group, who saw this whole scheme for exactly what it was, a blatant attempt to disobey the whole point of the command. They knew this was a really dangerous game they were playing and felt like they had to say something. And they didn't beat around the bush. Their warning was super direct. They basically said, hey, do not disobey Allah. You have to stop this trick before you get punished for it. They were pleading with their neighbors, trying to make them see that you can't just hide your real intentions. A day of reckoning was, inevitable. But did they listen? Nope. The group breaking the Sabbath was just stubborn. They were loving the results of their little trick, all those fish, and they just refused to hear it. They completely ignored the warnings and decided to just double down on their whole plan. And this is where the story takes a turn. It gets dramatic and, honestly, pretty terrifying. Because you can't just keep ignoring a divine command, especially after you've been warned. Something had to give. A consequence was definitely on its way. So one day, it happens. The punishment arrives, and it's sudden. The righteous people in the town wake up and notice something's wrong. There's this chilling silence. The homes of the people who were doing the trick? Totally still. Their defiance had finally caught up with them. Because Allah had transformed them into monkeys. Yeah, the punishment was just as shocking as it was sudden. All those people who stubbornly kept up their little trick were turned into apes. It was this humiliating, terrifying sign. Their spiritual disobedience literally became physical. A powerful, unforgettable warning for everyone else. So what about the people who gave the warning? Well, they were saved. And their fate is a really important part of the story. It shows that it wasn't enough to just follow the rule themselves. They also did their duty by speaking out against the wrongdoing. They were saved because of their faith and their courage. Okay, so now that we know the story, let's kind of break it down. Let's talk about the lesson here, because this is way more than just some old story. It's a really powerful parable about rules, about our intentions, and about what it really means to be obedient.
And really, this story gives us the perfect definition of true obedience. It's not about being clever and finding technicalities so you can do whatever you want. It's about understanding the spirit of the rule, the why behind it, and then making sure your actions, and just as importantly, your intentions, are sincerely in line with that.
So, when you boil it all down, there are a few key takeaways. First, you just can't trick a higher moral code. It doesn't work. Second, your intentions are a huge deal. They're just as important as your actions. And finally, real obedience comes from sincerity, not from trying to find a clever little workaround. And that really leaves us with one last thing to think about. I mean, this story is ancient, for sure, but the human desire to find loopholes, that's timeless. So it kind of makes you ask yourself, right? What are these Sabbath rules in our own modern lives that we try to bend? Where do we focus on the technicalities, the letter of the law, when deep down we know we're totally missing the point and violating its spirit?